Lovely. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. It feels like a totally wacky time to be doing a lecture. I'm like thrilled that you're all here. Yeah, it's like really lovely to see you all here. It's so close to the end of term, right after thesis. It was really such a treat to see a lot of thesis projects yesterday here. It just seems like such a special community and a special group of people. Huge thank you as well to Stacy in the office who's been helping organize all of the complex logistics of getting somebody from Colorado out to here, as well as Carrie, of course, for inviting and that amazing introduction. And yeah, just making such a welcoming space. And then thank you as well to the Zube Endowment, Margaret and Irv from the Zube Endowment. Really thanks for that. Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna get into things now and talk through a couple projects. But first I want to talk through a little bit of a framing around speculative futures and speculative design. So I think we've all at this point seen images like this. We probably almost all made images something like this, like typed into our generative AI and made images something like this. And don't worry, it's not going to be like a lecture takedown of AI. We don't need that. That either already exists or we're not interested in that, whatever. But I have been noticing a lot that the easier and easier it gets to be making images like this, these kind of future images that are imagining kind of alternative futures to what we currently are experiencing outside, the easier that gets, the less and less plans or the less and less kind of careful consideration is being put into thinking about what we need to dismantle to create that future. And so because we can make these relatively easily, we don't then think of like, okay, to get to that future that seems so glossy and beautiful in our heads, we first need to take down the system of private property, which is something that came up in thesis yesterday, or the system of capitalism, whatever it is that we're trying to take down for that future. We also really need to be imagining how we do that as well. So increasingly these are becoming less and less kind of critical imaginings of the future, even though there's such a huge potential for speculative design, speculative futures to really think about positive kind of futures that we could land on that'll get us into a kind of more just and livable planet. And so that's really the core of what I want to talk about today. Within landscape kind of pedagogy, within how we teach you, within studio work in particular, I think we've seen a really big rise in this kind of thinking. These are two books that are really foundational in this thinking. They're both really interesting books, and in no way is this a takedown of what they're saying. And I think partly this is because, particularly in landscape and in planning, partly what we're really grappling with right now is how to design for such an uncertain future. So when you're thinking of like, okay, my design today that might be like a 10-year timeline to actually get built, like what will the world even look like in 10 years? What will it look like in 50 years when we're thinking of when this project will be used? And because that feels kind of insurmountable right now in terms of how different the world will be, we've really started to latch onto these ideas around speculative futures. And the other reason that we're starting to use speculative futures instead of just kind of like conventional design that maybe we're seeing today and mimicking or changing slightly is because of just like how do we confront problems that are like as big as the ones before us. And I don't need to, I mean, there's some things that I'll say that are a little bit downers, particularly on such a beautiful day outside. But I think we understand these problems that we're facing overall. And I think then fundamentally, because like one of the reasons that we're thinking about speculative futures is because as designers, we've really always been thinking about it and working in this space of imagining the future, and imagining the future, planning for the future, designing the future. And so this is really important. It's fundamental to how we work as designers. We wouldn't be designing things if we didn't kind of invest in what that future looked like. And so Joanna Hoffman, who wrote the Speculative Futures book, it's a super easy read if you're thinking about something that's like kind of relevant to your work, but is also easy to read over the summer. I would highly recommend it. But she's written really beautifully about speculative futures and suggests that at their best, speculative futures support a more proactive and feeling path, and the tools create a container to sense what could be and then work towards that present. And that's really the ideal behind speculative futures. So that's kind of what the ideal is that we're working towards. And there are some really great examples of speculative works. These ones in particular, I think the work of Mark Miller right now, he's working on a project called Work in Progress that I think does a really great job. So there are really wonderful examples. But also Hoffman, thinking back to that book, concedes that this isn't, that these can also be really easily co-opted by existing forces within the world. And so, said in maybe a less sinister way, if we don't dismantle the parts of the system that we've got and that have got us into the mess that we're currently in, we'll continue to operate and be imported, and those will kind of continue to operate and be imported into this future that we're imagining. And so in some ways, I'll give you this example. If we're thinking back maybe 10 to 15 years, we were imagining what like wonderful and richly layered designs for a future would be that we thought would like rethink what transportation looked like, would rethink what transportation could be beyond oil and gas. And what we've largely got is just a new way to consume things. I'm in Colorado. I don't know how big the Rivian is here, but it's like every third car where I am. And so there's a really excellent podcast if you're interested in this stuff, or after you listen to me, there's this really excellent podcast called Mining for the Climate. And it observes and makes this really interesting observation that although electric cars were initially seen as a way of solving a problem, so that problem being this need for transportation that isn't relying on carbon, instead companies like Rivian have invented a new market to profit from, and that's a very big difference from just kind of solving a problem. And so in the process, we've watched these kind of speculative futures or speculative ideas that we thought would be really wonderful, and we carefully imagined them through studio projects and really ambitious responses to things like the Green New Deal Super Studio Project. These have just kind of turned into business ventures. And so I would like you to keep this idea of keep the world adventurous forever as you look through this image here, which is the lithium fields in the Salar de Atacama in Chile. And one wonders if this kind of landscape is included in this keep the world adventurous forever, if this kind of is included in this vision of being a world to keep adventurous forever. We also have this kind of image, which is perhaps even harder to look at, which is what cobalt mining in the DRC looks like today. So cobalt is one of the critical minerals in this so-called green energy transition. We talk a lot about lithium, particularly in landscape. We talk a lot about lithium because it has a big environmental consideration. But in, sorry, Carrie, but in the human, and there's huge human impacts to lithium as well, and those are becoming stateside as well. There's a lot of new lithium projects opening in the United States. But the human cost of cobalt, particularly in the DRC, which provided 71% of all cobalt in 2021, has really, and it's really further ignited conflict across the country. And so while we construct these speculative futures, again, we need to be forever aware of how these can be twisted and pretty quickly turned into speculation. So thinking about real estate speculation or mineral speculation, which we're seeing in this case. And always be aware of who could benefit from the corruptions of our designs. And I know our designs always have the best intentions, but thinking through like, okay, what are practices that we can do to make sure that we don't end up in these spaces again? I think it would be pretty weird to be speaking here today and not talk about what's happening across campuses right now. So it's going on like literally right outside there in front of my hotel, but also across the country, across North America. And campus just opened at my alma mater today, actually. So one of the things that's interesting is that like students are indeed imagining a world otherwise, so indeed imagining a world that's like outside of, this isn't a Rivian commercial, this is actually deeply thinking about like what a world outside of our current situation could be. And so they're having teach-ins on campuses across the country, calling for ceasefires, demanding schools divest from war, which are not hugely radical demands, actually. They're in fact far less radical demands and far easier to accomplish things that they're proposing, like divest from weapons manufacturers, for example, as a university. And they're far easier to accomplish those things than a lot of the things that I've seen proposed in speculative futures. Despite that, this is obviously what we're seeing. This is what I woke up to as I went down for like hotel breakfast, the CNN coverage of the clearing of the
UCLA encampment. And so there's a lot more I could say on this, obviously. But instead, I'm really bringing it up as a kind of moment of recognition of what's going on outside, as well as an example of the kind of militarized response that often comes with proposals for a future. So although it's very easy to type into Midjourney, like, speculative future for like a green and peaceful world, how we get there is actually quite hard and quite messy, and can be quite violent, which is what we're seeing today. So what does that mean for design? And what does that mean for the ways we try to imagine a future otherwise? And not just imagine, but like build and dismantle and create a future otherwise. So I'm going to talk about two projects today that are very close to my heart, two projects I've been working on for a really long time. The second of which is this coloring book Carrie brought up. And the first of which is thinking about a roadway on the edge of, in a kind of random place, probably to a lot of you, and it's research that I've been working on for a really long time. I do want to recognize that there's food at the back, and I'm so happy you're here. So if you need to get up and have a snack, like, do it. I teach. Like, I know, A, how hungry you all are all the time, and B, I'm not offended when people get up and do stuff. So like, if you do need food, please go get it. So the first project that I'm going to talk about in this kind of thinking about critical histories of speculation is really where by thinking about this relationship between speculative design on one hand, which is what I was just talking about, and speculation, particularly land speculation, began. And my work on this isn't a design project. You're not going to see a bunch of beautiful, there's some maps that I made, but there's not a bunch of beautiful like renderings. Definitely nothing as beautiful as what I saw yesterday. But instead, it's really a critical history of design. And my hope in showing it to you today is we can learn from methods to think about how speculative proposals shape our landscapes. So in some ways, in unanticipated ways, our speculative proposals end up really shaping the spaces that we've lived in. And we're not the only ones doing it. So today I'm going to talk to you about a project that's been designed since the 1960s that's greatly changed landscapes that we exist in today. So this is all based off my fieldwork in Colombia, where I've been working for the past 8 years on this project, so it's a long project. And that project overall is telling a history of a highway within the country to understand the impacts of infrastructures on landscapes. So just before the turnoff to a forest road on the edge of the upper Amazon basin in Colombia, there's this large billboard declaring the Amazon is dying, help us save it. This billboard is specifically funded by this interreligious group for tropical forests. And on my last trip to San Jose, which is the closest kind of city nearby, city or kind of town nearby, so this is in 2022 that I took this picture, they also had this poster up in the airport, so it's a pretty widespread movement in the region. I'm really fascinated by these posters because I always, when I see them, or these billboards, posters, when I see them, I'm always thinking, like, who is this for? Like, who's walking along? Often billboards are like to sell something to you. Who's just walking along and waking up and thinking, like, I think I'm going to deforest a little bit of the Amazon today, and sees this and is like, greatly impacted by it and decides not to. So I'm really interested by these billboards. This is another one that's a bit further along the road that I researched. And this one's actually in part funded by USAID, and it pledges, like, from my heart, I say no to deforestation. Again, who is this for? So the cues to deforestation, though, although I'm kind of question these frequently, the cues to deforestation are all around in the landscape. So these are either in the form of, I'll show you some pictures in a minute, but these like freshly burnt stumps amidst bright green fields, or the kind of aftermath, which is these really extractive forms of agricultural production, so such as cattle ranching and oil palm plantations along this road. So these have all replaced really complex ecosystems. International attention, that's largely what is funding these, has recently turned to scrutinize tropical deforestation as an emergency that has serious implications for climate change globally. And anxiety is mounting, and sorry to really ruin your day, but mounting about the Amazon reaching its feared tipping point, either close to or maybe has already reached, in which it will start emitting more carbon dioxide than it absorbs. So today, I really want to share with you this really specific history of a stretch of this forest road to try to tease out the relationship between deforestation, infrastructure, and land speculation, and set these into a kind of broader historical context. if there's time at the end, I'd love to kind of like continue this conversation with you about who these maybe are for, and because there's some really interesting kind of theory and literature around messages like this that are largely blaming poor people for environmental ills, although they're like largely the people that are not involved in the bigger processes that cause things like deforestation. So this is the road that I'm talking about. It's a really unassuming stretch of road that I'm talking about when I show you pictures of it, but it's part of this larger highway project called the Marginal de la Selva. And before I dive into the histories of that road and how it was planned, I do want to take a moment to really pause and think about the region and think about actually the amount of deforestation that's happening in the region, because it is alarming. So kind of current conditions of deforestation really help articulate the relationship between road building and deforestation, which is something that Massachusetts has a history of, like a long history of. I don't know if any of you go to the Harvard Forest and see all of those dioramas there, but definitely that was something I did when I lived here. But definitely has this history of deforestation that isn't so dissimilar. It's just obviously in a very different place with a very different landscape and happening at a massively different scale. So the area I'm discussing today is in the kind of eastern and southeastern part of Colombia. Will this work? Yeah. No. So it's largely, I'll move over to this one. So it's largely kind of where there's like a dotted line in between, just in there. But the highway runs the whole stretch of and it's a proposed highway project that has never been finished, and I'll get into that in a little bit, that runs the whole stretch of the country and then passes into other countries as well. So I've been on this road, or what exists of this road, many times since 2016, and each time there's new evidence of forest clearing along it. I had to take a pause in field work for COVID, and because it's a very remote area, really be quite careful about people's well-being until there was a vaccine. And so it was really, really alarming in that pause, because it was a longer period of time, the amount of deforestation that happened along this road. So each time I go back, there's new evidence of forest clearing. Sometimes it's this kind of like, there's certain places where I can't take photos along the road for safety reasons, but in some of those places you'll see like actively burning places or kind of still smoldering on the side of the road. And then in other places you see examples like this one here, which is stumps in these kind of freshly cleared fields. And that's not things grow quite quickly in this environment, so that's maybe 6 months post-fire, like post-cutting and fire. This, to me, is a really interesting image. It's kind of sickening to see. This is a log from a massive tree that's being hollowed out and used as a culvert on the road. So in the effort to kind of like improve this road that is terrible in its conditions, they're actually like using things that are logged from the forest to improve the smoothness and fastness of the road. That's a huge problem, actually, for deforestation, which is largely caused by land speculation. Any improvements in road surface, there's been a decent amount of research done in Brazil on this, but any improvements in road surface in this type of environment leads to immediate spikes in land speculation. So people moving to places or moving into land to clear land to then claim ownership of it, because as soon as a road is better or exists, it means that's a place that could be used for beef or oil palm or any kind of agricultural product to quickly come out of it. And then if a road gets paved or you propose to pave that road, it's even faster going into that space and getting things out of it. And so that land becomes more expensive as well. So it's mostly agricultural kind of uses along this road. And these like newly cleared areas, but there are businesses that kind of come in as well that people are interested in, and they stretch kind of further along into it, including this combination playground resto bar, which is a relatively innovative combo. The resto bar, super common. The combo playground resto bar, not as common. With this kind of, the resto bars are kind of common typology, but the name of this like breaks my brain, so that you would like cut down essentially the Amazon and then name it like the Amazon after the company. There's like so many levels of signs that signified happening in it that it definitely breaks my brain. So these are the kind of like, you know, experiences on the road, that kind of like what's your experience, but at a bigger scale, diving into the kind of data on deforestation over the last 20 years really helps reveal the extent of land use change. And that confirms kind of these roadside observations. So thinking about methods here, there's like mapping is one way of kind of analyzing space, and then there's obviously this kind of field work happening within this as well. So it's situated, the road is in this area, situated between two national parks. And parks in this region, definitely, this is not unique to Colombia, are often referred to as paper parks, where they're not like park on paper, but it's not 100% enforced, so it's not like as protected as maybe some spaces that we know and love within the US context. So it's situated between these two national parks. And then the road really, over time, kind of thickens through rapid forest conversion each year that stretches further and further along these ancillary roads that are developed and kind of like grow into this space. So this map maybe shows that a little bit better. So the black lines are these smaller roads that have developed off of this main road. And those just kind of develop. People just make them. Wherever they kind of want one, they make one. And it turns into this kind of widespread network of road development that then lets deforestation get further and further into the Amazon area. And so you're seeing that for sure in this forest loss mapping, where the kind of darker purple areas that are stretching further and further away from the road and into those park areas are more recent. And I need to update these maps. There's kind of actually some new data that just came out. And so then thinking about how this like space and how this deforestation happens at an even smaller scale, I'll dive into a way that maybe makes it even more visible. So I'm going to show you some of these aerial change in forest cover along Marginal de la Selva, and this is just outside of a town called Cachicamo. Cachicamo is an interesting place. It definitely has experienced a lot of conflict throughout the more recent civil conflict in Colombia, and even after the most recent peace deal has been retaken by some dissidents, and so it's actually quite contested territory, which can lead to an increase in deforestation, because if there's very little ability for the government to control what's happening in the region, which there definitely is in Cachicamo. There's no government oversight there. It's under like guerrilla rule. It means that there's not a ton of ability for anybody to tell people to stop cutting stuff down, growing certain crops, et cetera, et cetera. So when I started researching the road, I'd been warned about deforestation, and people were like, oh, that's like the deforestation road. You picked the road where there's the most deforestation. And the person that first told me about this was somebody that told me that road construction in this region, and I think across the Amazon, is referred to como la espina del pescado, so like the spine of the fish. So it like works in this way that's like a singular road with, again, those like smaller branching roads off of it. And so the spatial analogy to me is apt and vivid image of road building in the region. So a road in the forest creates access to land for agricultural uses, and it often catalyzes construction of new road networks branching off the initial incision. In this context, the roads that reach seemingly into unsettled landscape frontiers lead to further roads and provide access for agricultural productivity. So there's kind of this fractal branching form of the roads that brings with it swift waves of deforestation in a process that once started becomes nearly impossible to control, which is what we're seeing in Cachicamo. So I'll walk through these landscapes of change right now relatively quickly, so you can see the difference in change from 2000 to 2006 to 2012 to 2016, which was an important year, which is the year that the peace treaty with the FARC was signed between the government and the FARC. And so between 2016 and 2020, we've had that much deforestation in this region. So it's just a huge amount of forest cover loss in a region that is seen as probably one of the most diverse, biodiverse regions in the world. It's between the Andes and the Amazon, so it's not just an Amazon area. It's kind of like in this super important ecological gradient between the two. So there's been, obviously, people have noticed this, there's been sustained outcry by environmental groups, and this outcry led then President in 2018, Juan Manuel Santos, to declare that the project would not continue anymore, so Marginal de la Selva, no more, okay? Because of concerns over deforestation. But what is interesting about these like speculative designs is that once they're put in people's heads, they're pretty hard to get out of people's heads. So the project has never been finished, and the route of the official road has actually never been officially finished on a map. It's not there. But if you go to the site, it's been auto-constructed by colonos and armed actors and land speculators, depending on kind of who uses it. Colonos here is like peasant, largely kind of just like peasants that are building it. And so this is actually what the road looks like. So it's not that it doesn't exist, it just exists in a not great form. But it exists well enough to get agricultural products in and out. And so despite the official cancellation in 2018, this is in 2019, I'll show you pictures from 2022 as well, it's still going strong. People use it, they build new paths into the forest for agricultural uses, and they structure their lives really in anticipation of this broken promise of a highway at the edge of the forest. People moved here because they thought there would be a road, and now they're like, well, there will be a road, we'll just build it. And it's been, being constructed for a long time. And so these are really the conditions on the road. Now it's improving with each visit as I go, which is great for the people who live along it and terrible for the environment. So there's this really interesting tension in the fieldwork that I do between what people want in this space, or not all people, but what a lot of people want that live along it, who are by no means super rich or live super luxurious lives, and the kind of huge environmental destruction that, like me as a person that just loves the environment, has to kind of grapple with in my work a lot. So these are the conditions. This is a pretty scary bridge crossing. You have to kind of get out of the truck every once in a while because it won't hold the weight of both the truck and the road. Again, they're using the kind of like logs from cutting down the forest to build the bridge as well, so similar to that culvert, but this one's a full-on bridge. And then these are some of the uses. So obviously some of our big environmental, the worst things in the environment right now, one is oil palm plantations. There's some rubber plantations as well. There's a long history of rubber production in this region, and particularly to the south of this region in Colombia. So there's a little bit of rubber, there's a growing amount of oil palm, and there's just a huge amount of cows. The cattle is largely produced for, it's these like big landholders that don't live anywhere near here, and then there'll be kind of smaller farmers that are working the land, but there's like generally big landowners that are gaining money from these spaces. So deforestation in this region is super devastating, but how do we get here? So these kind of like, how do these patterns of land speculation that are pretty intractable come to be? They were actually set in motion, it was 100% planned. So it's like, this isn't like, oh, how could we possibly be deforesting the region? It was 100% planned. A road was conceived of in 1963 as an international route to connect Venezuela to Bolivia through Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. And the Marginal de la Selva in Colombia is this kind of unfinished and contested road. So on one hand, the kind of thinking back into like how people were positioning the road, this kind of speculative design for a speculative future of a new road in the region, the route promised this economic integration of these regions that were really long considered at the periphery of the Colombian state. I won't get into Colombian history for you too much. But on the other hand, building the project, has big environmental considerations. But to people that were really excited about the project, this is the president of Peru at the time, who was the big, actually was an architect, went to school at University of Texas for his architecture degree, and then went back to Peru to largely design roads, or not design roads, but like become the biggest fan of roads within Peru, and a lot of road projects developed because of him. And so these kind of this idea for him was about how to like colonize land in the country of Peru and then in the country of Colombia, etc. To colonize land without referring to roads is like discussing air transportation without considering airports. And so for him, the idea of roads is fundamental to being able to colonize, use, and gain access to land, but also all of these agricultural products that are listed. One of them is like wood from cutting down all the trees, oil palm, cattle, like all of the things that are currently happening. And then oil production as well, which happens kind of further to the south. There's kind of these manifesto-like obsessions with building this road, how it will totally transform the region, how it will alleviate all of the suffering in the country. And so this is a priest that spoke about the road, at length, like pages and pages and pages, spoke about the road at length. This is actually from a speech that he gave on the importance of the construction of the road. And the idea is that like the country itself will have gratitude to the efforts of the state for building the road, and the realization of this road opens new horizons. This kind of real view that this design and this speculation for the future was like what would totally change the future. Then they got to quick work. So there's this thinking around like, this is a great big idea, how do we then make it happen? They got to work producing maps like these to identify regions along the road that would be these colonization zones. They're kind of like not 100% good translation between colonización that's being used here and colonization in English. Our kind of histories of colonialism differ, but aren't entirely different. But these kind of regions of colonización within the country, this is in the 1960s, so it's not that long ago that people are speaking about colonizing these green regions along the road. And then they're drawing up these elaborate plans for like what the new town development will look like along the road. The central squares, all these plots of land, and all of this. People can live there, but they can also be producing a lot of food for the rest of the country, producing food to ship it out and make Colombia a rich country. I spent a lot of time analyzing the feasibility study of the project, which is not particularly, it's it's actually a super interesting document. It's produced by a US company based in New York called Tippett, Abbott, McCarthy, and Stratton. They're very well known for producing documents like this, but really it thinks of this road as creating this zone of influence that can be used for agricultural products along it. So they go through in a lot of detail to map, thinking through all of these landscape factors that we know around slope, around soil type, what types of crops would grow along it, and they start to then think, okay, well, how much money are we going to make from each aspect of the road? And so on the side, you get these kind of like different types of crops that are being cultivated, types of grasslands that could be used for cattle, forests and forest products that could be harvested. And then like, okay, how much money are we going to make? And does the payoff make sense? Essentially, that's what they're thinking through this project. So there's a lot of this kind of like mapping of the region, thinking about regional planning through infrastructure development in a really big way. And so there's a big influence in this process of also, it's not just the road alone that does this, it's not just the mappers and the planners and there's not landscape architects working on this project in Colombia at the time, but there's also a huge investment of the Texas Petroleum Company, International Petroleum Company, the Inter-American Development Bank, ESSO Colombia, Shell Colombia, Phillips Petroleum Company of Colombia, USAID, Colombian Public Works Department. All of these companies and organizations are coming together to imagine like what the future of this space could look like. And then we land on coming back to this sign. So going back to this sign and thinking through, this was a huge speculative project in the 1960s, set in motion by huge players, largely for their own benefit. So we've opened up, there's pretty big oil fields along the road. There are, as you saw, cattle, like endless amounts of cattle, different agricultural products, illicit or non-illicit, along the road as well. And that's all been encouraged by very large players. And these longer histories have been planned for, encouraged, incentivized, and they've all change the conversion of forested lands into spaces for agricultural production and export. And I think it allows us to really think about the ways in which speculative designs have lasting impacts that we live amongst today. And so we can kind of think through, like, what are our speculative designs going to do into the future? And how do projects like this not get, 100% just wrapped up in the same logics of colonization, extraction, and kind of, land speculation that we're seeing today. I'm going to move, for the sake of time, into this last project, which I'll talk about for a shorter period of time. And it changes locations entirely, although there is mining obviously happening in this part of Colombia as well. But this project and body of work, again, a body of work I've been working on for a long time, with collectively working on it though, which is lovely. And the idea behind it is to counter extractivism that we're seeing today. So this isn't really a fancy speculative project, it's not like shiny, but it's a way that we work to kind of imagine effective and better futures. So I briefly showed you at the beginning, thinking around electric cars, the way that the mining industry really latched on to this need for critical minerals, and they're stoked. Like, if you are like me and you research this and you read like mining reports, they're very excited. All of these big companies are very, very excited for the green energy transition because they'll make a ton of money off of it. But it's not really just about the act of mining, so that's part of it. But part of what I'm really interested in is how resource extraction is like woven throughout cultural institutions as well. This is the work of Maggie Flynn that looks at specifically oil money across in Canadian cultural institutions. Her work is really phenomenal. Camille Sharp has also previously theorized this kind of extractive politics of cultural production. I've presented on this work and like arrived at the room I'm supposed to present in, and it's like the Trans-Canada Pipeline room, or these like endowed things or buildings named after like Imperial Oil Room or whatever. So for sure, this is like throughout cultural institutions. So it's not just it's not just thinking about this in the context of just active mining. We're also through Beyond Extraction as a collective. We're really thinking about mining as this kind of like bigger thing that's like basically rules the whole world around us. And although I talk a lot about Canada, this isn't just a Canadian problem. So I really thought that I'd never live anywhere that loved mining as much as Canada, which is where I'm from. And then I moved to Colorado, and I have never seen people that are more into mining than Colorado. So these are from the National Mining Museum, which is in Leadville, which is a wonderful place to visit. Do not let the mining museum distract you. Mining museum also awesome place to go, but maybe for more dystopian reasons. So this isn't just a Canadian thing. This isn't just a kind of regional thing. And in fact, at the end of this kind of like long tour through the building, the mining museum like leaves you with how to mine the moon, thinking about the future, how to mine asteroids, how to mine the moon. And so this too is speculative design, so we're not the only ones doing this. There are lots of people out there thinking about how to kind of change the future in probably not so great ways. So a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today related to this project is actually thinking through these big organizations. The one I'm going to talk about today is called PDAC, which is the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada. My computer's about to die, 1 second. Okay, got it. So this is this big association that is self-described as a leading voice of mineral exploration and mineral development. It's massive as an organization, and it holds this massive mining conference each year in Toronto. That's where it chooses to hold the mining conference. Why does it hold it in Toronto, you might ask? 70% of all mining companies are headquartered in Toronto, or in Canada, most of those in Toronto, some of them in Manitoba. So it's all mining companies in the world. It's like the biggest kind of mining country by far. And so for the last couple of decades, so they hold this big conference. In the last couple of decades, there's been an amazing history of activists protesting at PDAC. Mining Justice Solidarity Network is a really great example, and kind of facilitating direct action that includes everything from holding vigils for activists killed that have opposed mining projects to banner drops and demonstrations. And we're informed by this tradition as Beyond Extraction. We're a collective of scholar activists. Lots of us are designers, so probably designers hold an outsized role. There's landscape architects, there's planners, there's a couple architects as well. And we really work to think through what I was talking about before. Not just imagining what the world beyond extraction is, but also thinking, how do we counter what we're currently seeing within the kind of misuse of cultural institutions by mining organizations. One of the biggest ones we've taken on recently, and this is where the coloring book comes from, is this wing called Mining Matters. So PDAC, the Prospectors and Developers Corporation of Canada, the largest mining lobby essentially in the world, has an educational wing. So this wing that they develop educational materials for public schools and public education. They do a lot of different things in public education, and it's under this banner of building mineral literacy through STEM education, and so they prepare a lot of STEM education products to be used in public education, which we all know is deeply underfunded, and teachers are heroes but need all the help they can get when it comes to teaching things like geology, and so they often will turn to Mining Matters materials. One of the things they've produced is these really problematic coloring books for students. So these are these coloring books. Really unfortunately, if you agree with me, they also have translated the coloring books into a lot of Indigenous languages, which is deeply problematic. A lot of northern Indigenous languages, which in Canada, where most of our mining takes place, is in the north. And it's really hard for people to find content in Inuktitut, for example, and so the fact that it's most of the, or not most of the content, but that some of it is being produced by mining companies is quite problematic. So with Beyond Extraction, we were like, that's a huge issue, what should we do? And so we produced this new coloring book called What It Takes. I have a couple. I thought there would be fewer people here, so I'm very thrilled you're all here, but I have like as many as I could fit in my suitcase without it being absurd with me, and I'm happy to give them out to anybody. But it's this coloring book that really takes aim at the extractive industries and thinking through, and this is our logic in Beyond Extraction, which is to think through in this like, how do we counter what we're seeing as fundamentally wrong with what's happening? So we did a lot of, I don't know, for those of you that withstood the pandemic and Miro days, we're all over the US and Canada, and we work a lot actually in Miro, so maybe it won't end for you. I'm sorry for you to hear. But really thinking through these different themes. So each of the pages of the coloring book, or each of the spreads of the coloring book has a different theme. So one of those is financialization, and we did a ton of kind of research in the processing for this to think through like, what do we really need to take aim at to teach people like what is currently broken about our system. So thinking through this financialization, who gets rich off of the mining that we're seeing. So the Royal Bank of Canada, it's the top financer for the fossil fuel industry. That's the Royal Bank of Canada there, and that is the oil sands that they are the biggest funder of within Canada. This kind of, if you can't tell, those little dots are massive dump trucks. So like at least 15-ton dump trucks. So huge scale of devastation happening, funded by these shiny buildings. This building actually has gold in the glass plating, so it's like one of the most expensive materials ever. It like glistens and it's totally gold. So from that, looking at that, we then produce this kind of spread, which is really considering how actually, it's really hard to write this stuff, go from a word like financialization that we all know at the beginning, to then how do you make that into a coloring book, and thinking through like, Toronto is a mining capital, but how do minerals actually lead to wealth for some, but not for all? Thinking about camps and violence, so there's a typology, kind of urban design typology and architecture typology of man camps is what they're called. So this is a kind of type of urbanism that's popped up. It's been talked about a lot, and a lot of people have theorized this, but there are these kind of remote sites of extraction that get built, and these are man camps. They're super devastating for the communities that they're in, and I'll wrap up shortly, don't worry, Carrie, that they're in. They have been largely critiqued as being one of the biggest causes of missing, well, it's like directly linked to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, in terms of there's this huge influx of people not from a community, often quite close to a remote Indigenous community, and leads to very big conflict and very big issues. And so thinking through, like, how do we write? This is definitely the most text we had to write to try to contextualize some of that on the board. And then ending on thinking through resistance as well. So not just thinking through, like, this is all stuff that we're countering for the first time, but there are long histories of resistance from the Wet'suwet'en land defenders here to then kind of thinking about how those demonstrations come onto infrastructure and think through blocking infrastructure. What are they dismantling? This is, you know, them standing beside oil tankers on railway infrastructure, as well as really amazing kind of Indigenous artists that have done a lot of work and were quite generous to let us use one. Christy Belcourt was really generous to let us use one of her drawings. She's a very well-known Métis artist in the coloring book as well, and think through these like long histories of resistance that have existed. And so the project isn't, you know, it's not like a speculative shiny new future of like, this is what the future should look like, although like something like this is probably a nice place to start. But what I think it does do and why I shared it today is I think it offers a way of like really thinking about how to creatively counter stuff that we see that we're like, that's not right, and we don't want to bring that with us into the future that we're designing. And so how do we kind of start to counter that? And setting up ways of identifying what it is you're trying to counter and then countering it and incorporating that into your designs is, I think, really, really important. So that's where I'll leave it. So I think that came across. I'll leave it there. If there are questions, things like that.
That sounds great. Thank you. It's perfect time. We have a few minutes for questions if anyone has one.
Lovely. I'm coloring books too.
Right up here, Mike.
Hi.
I'm curious, I guess this is interesting to me when you talked about the road in particular.
Yeah.
We talk about equitability a whole lot in this program. And, you know, the financialization of it and who's actually making the money is one thing. But the notion that these people are just trying to get their piece of the pie with these roads, it's just an interesting dynamic there where it's easy to say we shouldn't be deforesting Colombia, but then when we juxtapose that against, well, what have we already deforested in the U.S. and other developed nations? You know, where does that responsibility fall? So it's not really a question, just so much a thought that was provoked in listening to what you were saying.
No, I super appreciate that. And I actually started the study of the road not thinking about the environment at all. I was actually quite interested in the social history of this road because it's been developed over time as a kind of way of government control into regions that were like FARC controlled or, you know, controlled by non-state violent actors. And I was really actually interested in that. It wasn't until I got there that I was like, oh, there's a huge amount of deforestation happening here. And my little, like, you know, white North American environmentalist brain was like, save the trees. Yeah. And then so I've always kind of grappled with that as this like, and I think I frame it through deforestation because I think a lot of us, particularly in the landscape, are like, oh God, we gotta save that. But 100% by thinking on the road, and sometimes people will straight up be like, well, should they build it or should they not? And I'm like, it's a really impossible question, especially when people have been promised a road that will improve their living conditions, and then they've been failed by.
Well, and that's the second part of it, where at the end of the day, whoever is making the money, is it even making it back to these places where the roads are built?
For sure, yeah. I mean, some of it is making it back. I don't want to make these places seem like they don't have any money. Not all of that money is potentially legally made. There's really pockets of quite a bit of money in these places, but a lot of this money is, again, those landholders that live far away, people, and then those are the people that are like, we just want a road that doesn't take, like, I don't know miles super well. The stretch of road that I spend a lot of time on is like 100 kilometers. It can take 10 hours, so I don't know, it can take 10 hours to drive on it because it's so bad. You have to get out and the car gets stuck, or the truck gets stuck. So of course, like, people want a better road. They're not, and they might be fixing the road, but they're not actually really making money from it. Yeah. Like maybe a small amount. No, it's, to me, that's why I think it's such an interesting place, not and like probably more like a lot of places, even close by here, because it's one of those like really intractable problems. If you can't just be like, turn that into a park, which has happened in lots of places. A lot of conservation work is critiqued now because it's like, this is gonna be a park and we're gonna kick all the indigenous people out of this space to make it into a park. And yeah, it's super problematic. So it's like, it's not really an answerable thing.
Sure.
But other questions or things that come up for people, context stuff.
Wonderful presentation, Zannah. Thank you. I'm curious about the coloring book. It's so intriguing, and I'm definitely going to get a copy.
Yeah, run up to the front first.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So yeah, how do you foresee the collective that you are like disseminating this? Like how? How is that? Yeah, what is that process? And
we have. It's online, so it's like people can download it and print it, and there's like full print instructions and different ways to download it. So it's online, and we kind of share that through social media and things like that. We also have this has been really lovely, is like, we just print them, and we just use like our budgets of where we work to print them. Like I just print these in the, in the kitchen of my office. Just print them and then take them to particularly like independent bookstores or like bookstores that have a zine section. I'm like, hey, can you give these out? Which I think it seems to be working pretty well. It's not like, that's not mass distribution, we'll just take us back. And bookstores are like so thrilled, they're lovely people, so they're so thrilled to like have them. So far that's what we've been doing. We have some like thinking about online distribution through like people that are already distributing similar stuff, so Just Seeds is an organization that does stuff like that. But we haven't fully thought through that. I would say that's our worst, as a group, that's the worst thing. We're like so excited to make